Bones of the skull are classified into two groups: cranial bones, which surround the brain, and facial bones, which obviously form the face, and they don't surround the brain. There are 6 names for cranial bones. 2 of those are in pairs, so it's 8 bones total. The frontal bone, as you would expect, is in the front. It forms the forehead, the brow ridges, and also continues in the upper surface of the eye socket, also called the orbit. If we open the skull cap, we can see the other side of that surface. So here inside the skull, or in the cranial cavity, that's the other side of the portion that's in the eye socket. So that's the frontal bone. Now all of these orange lines are sutures. Those are the joints where skull bones meet. So anywhere you see an orange line, that is the edge of a bone. Major sutures have names. This one at the posterior edge of the frontal bone is called the coronal suture, like a coronal section, coming in from the top, dividing the body into front and back. Posterior to the frontal bone are the 2 parietal bones. Parietal means on the wall. This is the wall of your skull. They meet in the center at the sagittal suture, like a sagittal cut, vertical, dividing the body into sides. They come down to here. This is called the squamous suture. It connects the parietal bone to the temporal bone. Temporal as in your temples. We'll come back to the temporal bone. There are a lot of features on it that we need to look at. Posterior to the parietal bone is the lambdoid suture, named for the Greek letter lambda. Looks like an upside down V. And this bone is the occipital bone. Often found along the lambdoid suture, sometimes on other sutures, are sutural bones. On this skull, there are just a few tiny ones. On this one, if you can see it, there are some larger ones here. And here. So the sutures are where the bones grow together. They're not fused at birth. And sometimes bone is built in those sutures and grows outwards, leaving separate little bones along the lines. Those are the sutural bones. So those are your major cranial bones: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital. There's just one occipital, 2 parietal, 2 temporal. Frontal starts out as 2 separate bones. In all the models, they've completely fused, but in a lot of us, there is still a suture partway down between them, and sometimes you can feel that on your head. On the occipital bone, this continues underneath and comes forward, surrounding this big hole, which is called the foramen magnum. That's Latin for big hole. Foramen is the term for holes in bones. There are many foramina, that's the plural, in the skull. This is the most important one. It's where the spinal cord connects to the brain. On the sides of it are these smooth, raised areas, and if you tilt, it's thicker there. These are called the occipital condyles. A condyle is a rounded surface where 2 bones meet. This is where your skull rests on your spinal column. So those are the important features of the occipital bone. The temporal bone, we'll start anterior and work our way back. This spike here is called the zygomatic process. It's called that because it reaches toward this bone, which is called zygomatic, and that's one of the facial bones. We'll come back to it. Together, they form the zygomatic arch, which is this gap, or rather this ridge that makes this gap, and muscles pass through here. Posterior to the zygomatic process, marked out with this rubber on this skull, is the mandibular fossa. I'll switch skulls so we can see what it really looks like. So, the mandible is your lower jaw, and it articulates with the temporal bone in those indentations. So a fossa is a shallow indentation in a bone. Often, but not always, a place where bones meet. And this mandible isn't quite the right size, but it roughly fits into the two mandibular fossae. Posterior to the mandibular fossa, on the side, is another indentation. This is actually the entrance to a tube, the ear canal. And this is called the external auditory meatus, or sometimes external acoustic meatus. So that's your ear hole. And then behind it is the mastoid process. You can feel this behind your ear, and it's a place where muscles attach. There's also a styloid process, this little spike. You can't feel that because it's too far in your skull. There are also muscles that attach to that, but they're small ones that help in swallowing. If we come underneath, you see the temporal bone surrounds these structures and comes in a little further toward the center. So occipital comes all the way up, temporal comes in along the sides. Our next cranial bone is anterior to temporal and occipital. From underneath, we can see it here. It has a small bridge in the center, these two ridges, these little spikes, and then it comes up the sides. This is a single bone called the sphenoid bone. From the lateral view, you can see part of it here between temporal and frontal. So sphenoid bone continues across both sides. Our best view of it is inside the cranial cavity. So the top level is mostly frontal bone. This ridge at the back, you can see where there's a suture separating bones, is part of the sphenoid bone. And then down here is more of the sphenoid bone. It has these two basically wings. And then in the center, there are little bumps and an indentation. Let's see if we can see from the side where that goes in. This is called the sella turcica, which means Turkish saddle. So it kind of looks like a saddle. What sits in it is your pituitary gland. That's part of the brain, an endocrine gland that controls a lot of other glands. So sphenoid comes out to here, and then temporal forms the rest of this center level. Temporal also forms this ridge and continues down into the lowest level, which is mostly occipital here. Our last cranial bone is the hardest one to get a look at because it just kind of peeks through between other bones in multiple places. We can see it here. This is why it's considered a cranial bone, is this little area. It's called the ethmoid bone, which means resembling a sieve or strainer. It's called that because of all these little holes. Those are called the cribriform plate, or they're called the cribriform foramina. They form the cribriform plate. The purpose of those holes is for the nerves from your nose to get up into your brain. There's a ridge in the middle of it called the crista galli, which means rooster's comb. Now, that's only part of the ethmoid bone. It is also found inside the nasal cavity. It forms the upper portion of the septum and two pairs of ridges on the side walls. Now, in these models, we usually can't see all three pairs. This lowest one is a separate bone that's a facial bone. This one is called the middle nasal concha, and that's part of the ethmoid bone. There's one further up inside called the superior nasal concha. These provide extra surface area in the nasal cavity to help warm and moisturize the air as it comes through. The last place we can see the ethmoid bone is in the eye socket. So we have frontal here at the top, and then this square piece below it, kind of midway back, is also part of the ethmoid bone. And that is the other side of the portion that forms the wall of the nasal cavity. So that's your 6 cranial bones: frontal, parietal, temporal, occipital, sphenoid, ethmoid.